I yield the floor.
I appreciate his recitation of the chronology here and how this happened. These regulations are supposedly in response to the scandal that came up, although the President is not calling it a scandal, said there's not any evidence that there was any wrongdoing. But these plans were actually being developed a couple of years ago, so long before we knew that the IRS was targeting conservative organizations. And so the notion that this is in response to what just occurred is wrong. What is equally troubling, or more troubling, as the gentleman from Utah noted, that these plans in an internal memo were described as off-plan around the process, that were hidden. And so that's what we're asking in this legislation. Let's just not do any rulemaking until the results of the investigations that are going on come back to us. That's a prudent thing to do. I hope that we'll follow through. I yield to the gentleman from Texas, the minority whip, Mr. Cornyn.
Mr. President, I'll be brief. I just want to commend the Senator from Arizona and from Kansas and my friend and colleague from Utah, Senator Hatch, for their comments and for their support for getting the IRS out of the speech police business. If there's anybody who thinks the IRS doesn't have its hands full already, in addition to with the addition of the implementation of Obamacare on top of all of its other problems, I don't know anybody that thinks they need more to do, particularly when it comes to discriminating against people based upon their political affiliations and their desire to engage in debate in the arena and to advocate their views. And this is a politically neutral issue because we know this also will protect people on the left as much as on the right. But I have to agree with my colleagues that it appears that there's been a disproportionate attention being paid under this administration to people on the right. And I know my colleague from Arizona has heard of Catherine Engelbrecht of Houston, Texas, with King Street Patriots and True the Vote. She founded two organizations dedicated to improving elections and furthering the ideals of our founding fathers. Well, she led a coalition of citizen volunteers to work as election monitors, to provide resources for voter registration and to root out election fraud. You would think those would be commendable, not a reason for government discrimination and investigation. But for 3 years, the IRS denied her organization tax-exempt status, while comparable organizations, I think the senator from Arizona has pointed this out, have received basically expedited or fairly routine treatment. But in the meantime, she was subjected to over-the-top inquiries by the IRS and by the ATF even, and other government organizations. But the IRS wanted to subpoena her, every one of her tweets on her Twitter account, as well as entries made on her Facebook account. I mean, it's just as, you can't really make this stuff up, but it is extraordinarily offensive. So what these proposed rules are going to do are going to institutionalize the role of the IRS as the speech police, something we ought to avoid like the plague. We ought to make sure that people of all ideological and political affiliations are free to engage in their constitutional rights of association and of political speech. And I just want to point out in conclusion, there was 60 years ago, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a very important decision. It's called the NAACP versus Alabama. And the question there was whether the government could compel the disclosure of the membership list of the NAACP when the NAACP felt like its members would then be targeted by the government in a negative sort of way. And the Supreme Court said the Constitution of the United States and the First Amendment guarantees a right of free association in addition to a right of free speech, and that was constitutionally protected activity given the importance of that right under the Constitution and also given the likelihood of negative attention by the government. They said that the NAACP could keep its membership list confidential. So at a time when the American people have their taxes on their mind, I know my wife said that we have a deadline in our family by the end of February to get this to the people who help us prepare our tax returns. And with the midterm election looming, the last thing we need to do is to support the IRS becoming the speech police and suppressing the constitutionally protected rights of the American people. And particularly, I would say to my friend from Arizona that I pulled out a Gallup poll, a report dated January the 15th, 2014. Government was cited as the top problem. And so 21% in this poll said they were dissatisfied with the government and Congress, politicians, poor leadership, corruption, and abuse of power. What greater abuse of power could there be than to confer upon the IRS the legitimacy to intimidate and suppress people exercising their constitutionally protected rights of free speech? So I commend the senator from Arizona and others who are working on this. They can count on me to lend my voice and my support to their efforts.
Mr. President, I thank the gentleman from Texas and my other colleagues who have participated in this colloquy. I hope that we can speedily bring this Stop Targeting Political Beliefs by the IRS Act to the floor. The gentleman from Texas, when he talks about his constituents and what they endured at the hands of the IRS, how anybody can say that there's nothing amiss there or nothing wrong when somebody's asked an application for 501c4 status to give up their Facebook tweets or their Facebook posts and let the IRS review them and to see if they're worthy of receiving such status. There's something wrong there. I think Americans know that. So I appreciate the support of my colleagues on this legislation. I appreciate the gentleman from Kansas, my partner in this, and I yield back the floor. President, I note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arkansas.
Mr. President, I understand that we are in a quorum call.
We are.
I would ask that we dispense with the quorum.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today really for purpose of notification, and that is I want to just put the Senate on notice that later today or tomorrow I intend to ask for unanimous consent that two of my judge nominees be voted on this week. Both are non-controversial. Both have been heartily endorsed by Senator Bozeman, my colleague from Arkansas, and basically everybody else who's looked at this. They came out of the Judiciary Committee. One of them came out on October 31st. The other came out on November 14th. They're completely non-controversial. We have a sense of urgency here, not only because we have two vacancies on the federal bench in Arkansas, which is in and of itself a problem, but We have a real sense of urgency here because one of these judges is an elected judge, and in Arkansas those are nonpartisan elections. One of these judges is an elected judge, and the filing period for his seat opens up on February 24th and closes on March 3rd. So we find ourselves in a situation where we're here this week, then we'll be on recess next week, and then we'll come back on the evening of February 24th, presumably for 5:30 votes if things work on that day like they typically do around here. We'll presumably have a 5:30 vote. Well, at that point, the filing will be open. We have other lawyers and judges interested in that position, and there's a domino effect that happens in Arkansas because of that. So I'm not going to ask for unanimous consent right now, but I wanted to put all my colleagues on notice that I intend to do that either later today or tomorrow. So with that, Mr. President, I'll yield the floor.
The Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Thanks for allowing me to be on the floor. I'd like to speak for enough time to be consumed for my comments here.
Without objection.
Mr. President, first I want to thank Senator Pryor. Senator Pryor and a group of us have introduced a piece of legislation that rights are wrong, that makes sure that our military continue to receive their COLA in full course and full amount. As you know, we had a budget issue we worked through, and in that process, the COLA for our active retired military would be reduced by 1%. But we all knew that we would take the time, because we had the time after the budget passed, to fix this problem. We've already done it for our disabled retired veterans. Now it's to fulfill the final promise, the full promise of their COLA in total. I spoke last night about this issue, and then the vote occurred on cloture 94-0. 94-0. If that isn't an indication of how much support there is to make sure the COLA comes back in full force, I don't know what is. But I do know, starting right after that vote, we started to hear from people already, coming up with, well, I voted for cloture, but I have a caveat. I have some qualifications I want to add on that vote. I want to have these things in Washington, they're called pay-fors. Well, let me make it very clear, Mr. President, to the veterans in my state, 77,000 veterans who live in my state, the highest per capita in the nation is in Alaska. They've paid the bill. They've paid the bill time and time again, and I think this is such a perfect photo to give the example of our military who serve in combat, who serve on the front lines. And if you think about those that have already paid the ultimate bill, almost 6,800 service members have died in Iraq and Afghanistan. Alaska alone, 22. I'm going to read some of those names in a second, but first I want to make it very clear. You're going to hear these convoluted reasons why we should have this paid for, despite the fact, I wasn't here when they paid for these wars. Oh, I'm sorry, no, they didn't pay for these wars. $2 trillion plus they didn't pay for the wars. But now it's time to pay the bill for those that committed to serve our country, to go to the front lines when called upon, to ensure that we have the freedom we enjoy in this country. And now we're saying, well, yeah, we want to give you that retirement COLA, but there should be no but here. A promise made that we made is a promise we need to keep. My view is we should have their backs every single day, and this is a day to do it. When you think about the people who are going to have this convoluted reason why they have to have it paid for, let me make it very clear to them. This is a vote for vets or a vote against vets. They can have all, like I said, all their gobbledygook, their convoluted arguments, but at the end of the day, if you vote against this bill without all this stuff added to it, just a clean and simple, give the COLA back and let's move on. Let's give them their full COLA. If you vote against this bill, you're voting against vets. I don't care how you try to press release it, how you try to spin it, or what amendments you want to add because you want to try to convolute the situation and create a political situation for other members on other issues that are unrelated to vets. That's unacceptable. I'll say it again. A promise made, a promise is a promise we need to keep. We need to have their backs. They have our backs every single day to make sure this country is safe, no matter where American citizens are in this country and in this world. It is our time to do what's right for veterans. Again, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. President, I told some stories last night of Alaskans who are just struggling with this whole issue. The commitment they thought they had. One gentleman served 18 years already in the military. He's close to retirement. He's wondering, what did he sign up for? He knew he was serving his country. He's had enormous pressures on his family. He's moved 6 different times. 2 children, 1 disabled. A variety of personal issues, but he continues to serve this country. And for us to play politics about, well, we should start talking about immigration, we should start talking about child tax credits or this or that, forget it. It is time to do what's right for our veterans, to put this COLA back in full force. That is why over 30 veterans organizations support this bill. This bill with no pay for, clean and simple. Senator Pryor and I were on a phone call last week. Talked to many of these. They're anxious. I don't care if it's the Air Force Association or the Army Aviation Association or the Fleet Reserves or the Gold Star Wives, U.S. Army warrant officers. I can go through the list. 30-plus organizations that work with our veterans every single day want us to pass this bill, not an amended bill, this bill. Get it done. Give a peace of mind to our veterans and our retirees that they know, and our active military. Let me say one other thing. This puts our readiness to some degree at risk. Why do I say that? Well, if you're thinking about joining the military, part of when you're joining the military, you're looking at the benefits and how it all works. You know you're going to put your life on the line. At some point, you may be called to duty in a sense of life on the line. So they're looking at what those benefits are. What can they provide for themselves and their families? What's that retirement that they may become a career officer, a career enlisted member? What are they going to do? And now they're questioning, should they? I had some emails from some folks about their sons and daughters who are currently enlisted, now wondering, what do they get into? When at a moment's notice, the commitment, the promise we made, Congress can change overnight. Our readiness is at risk. The promises we made are questioned. The commitments that we make to our military. So today is the start of a day to make sure our commitments are there. Again, we cannot say to our veterans, sign up, we'll promise you these things, and tomorrow we might change them. That doesn't help our readiness, doesn't help our commitment. So again, Mr. President, I hope, and I know, and I get it, there's going to be a lot of policy wonk conversation down here by some members because they want to kind of confuse the issue to make it hard for people to understand what's really going on in Washington. Well, it's simple. It's very simple. I know that, matter of fact, just walked in the chairman of the Veterans Committee. He knows this issue. It's simple. It's about our vets. Very, very simple. You vote yes, you're for our vets. You vote no, you're against our vets. That's it. They can put all the spin, all the amendments they're going to try to craft to make it sound so good, you know, but in reality, they're trying to cover an activity that they are struggling with, and that is they don't necessarily like that some of us who are on this bill are the sponsors. I get that, but let's put aside our politics. Let's do what's right for the vets. Let's have their back. Let's keep the promise we made to them. And again, this bill is simple. It's not complicated. Matter, it's so simple, it's one page. It just says, repeal that action. It's not complicated. I would hope my colleagues on the other side who are wondering about what they should do, just vote for the vets. Vote yes on this. Don't mess with amendments. Don't try to have this pay-for convoluted argument that the vet at home who will be watching doesn't care about. They just want to make sure their COLA's there. And let's give them the peace of mind they deserve. Mr. President, I thank you for the time, and let me just end with one comment. I'm just going to read a few of the names who have paid the ultimate sacrifice. I read some of these last night. Gunnery Sergeant Christopher Eastman, Marines, age 28 from Moose Pass, Alaska. Sergeant Joe Clarkson, Army, age 23, Fairbanks. Lance Corporal Grant Fraser, Marine Reserves, age 22, Anchorage. Specialist Shane Woods, Army, age 23, Palmer. Again, just a few of the 22 Alaskans who have lost their lives. Now, I don't know if they would have been long-term career, if they stayed in the Army or Air Force, but they sacrificed their lives. They put their lives on the line to make sure that we do the right thing here. It is time we do it. Today's the opportunity. Don't convolute it with all kinds of amendments. You vote up or down, you're for vets or you're against vets. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I rise in strong support of the legislation on the floor. I think most members understand that as part of the 2013 bipartisan budget agreement, language was included which cut COLAs for military retirees. I think most members here in the Senate and the House understand that that was a mistake, an oversight, and it's something that should be rectified, and it should be rectified now. Promises made to people in the military should be kept, and our job is to do that. Mr. President, what I want to do this morning is say a word on broader issues impacting the veterans community, and I say that as the chairman of the Senate Veterans Committee. Shortly, when this legislation is disposed of, we are going to move on to a comprehensive piece of legislation that addresses many, many of the very serious problems facing our veterans community. And this morning I just wanted to give a brief, say a few words, give a brief overview of what that legislation does. The legislation is the Comprehensive Veterans Health and Benefits and Military Retirement Pay Restoration Act of 2014. It is S. 1982. And the first point that I want to make, Mr. President, is that I honestly believe that in terms of veterans issues, there is widespread bipartisan support. I can tell you that on our committee, the Veterans Committee, every member of that committee, Democrat or Republican or in my case independent, believes very much that we owe our veterans more than we can provide them. Their sacrifices are too deep, the pain too great. But that all members of that committee in a bipartisan way are doing their best to protect the interests of our veterans, and I want to thank all of them for their hard work. And to as great a degree as possible, the bill that will be on the floor, the Comprehensive Veterans Bill, is a bipartisan bill. It contains many, many provisions brought forth by my Republican colleagues. This bill consists of two omnibus bills that were unanimously passed by the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, unanimously, support of Democrats and Republicans. It also includes other provisions that had strong bipartisan support. This legislation also contains two new provisions, both of which have bipartisan support. The first new addition addresses the restoration of cuts made to military retiree COLAs as a result of the 2013 bipartisan budget agreement, the exact same issue that is being debated on the floor right now. We also have that language in our bill. Promises made to veterans have got to be kept. We've got to restore those cuts to COLAs for military retirees. And the second new provision that was not discussed, frankly, by the committee is also has widespread bipartisan support. It authorizes the VA to enter into 27 major medical facility leases in 18 states and Puerto Rico. Also, interestingly enough, The legislation that will soon be on the floor contains two major provisions already passed by the House Republicans. So, to as great a degree as possible, in terms of language in the bill, in terms of working with our Republican colleagues in the House, this is a bipartisan bill and should have the support of every member of the Senate who believes in protecting the interest of veterans, and I hope that is the vast majority of the people here. Mr. President, as Senator Begich just mentioned a moment ago, our veterans have paid a very, very heavy price. And if you would ask me what I have learned in the 1 year, a little bit more than a year that I've been chairman of the Veterans Committee, is I think most Americans, including myself, were not fully aware of what that sacrifice was. And what that sacrifice was just in recent years was not just the loss of over 6,700 Americans who lost their lives in Afghanistan and Iraq, but the impact of those wars on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of veterans who came home either wounded in body, loss of arms, loss of legs, loss of hearing, loss of sight, or the more invisible wounds of war. And, Mr. President, what most Americans don't know, and it's a rather shocking number, but we are now dealing with hundreds of thousands of men and women who came home from Iraq and Afghanistan who are doing their best to cope with post-traumatic stress disorder, which has a terrible impact on their lives, on their families' lives, on their ability to go out and get a job and keep a job, and traumatic brain injury, the result of being in the presence of these IEDs and all of the explosions that men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan experienced. We are also dealing in this rough economy, this struggling economy, this high unemployment economy, with many young veterans coming home unable to find jobs. Some who left in National Guard, decent jobs, came home and found that those jobs are not there. We are dealing with a fact that I think virtually every member in the Senate understands, that at a time when the VA went from paper to digital, made the transformation necessary to deal with the claims process, that claims process today remains too long. The backlog is too great. We have got to deal with that issue. We are dealing with a situation, Mr. President, where people were wounded in war, men and women were wounded in war, young men and women who had hopes and dreams of starting their own families, but as a result of injuries sustained in those wars, for whatever reason, lost their reproductive capabilities, and they still want to have families. We are dealing with issues of sexual assault, a scandal, an outrage that I know every member of the Senate feels strongly about. Women and men sexually assaulted, coming home in need of treatment, unable to get that treatment. We are dealing with a situation today above and beyond the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where today there are people, often women, wives, sisters, who are taking care under great stress of disabled veterans who have no arms and no legs. They've devoted their lives to those people, and they are hurting as well. Mr. President, as chairman of the Veterans Committee, what I have done is listened as carefully as I could to what the veterans community, representing millions and millions of veterans, some 22 million veterans, had to say about the problems that veterans are facing. And I and my very fine staff and my Republican colleagues and their very fine staffs, we work together And we said, all right, these are the problems facing our veterans. And we all know that on Veterans Day and on Memorial Day, every member of the Senate goes out and they give great speeches about how much they love and respect veterans and how much they appreciate the sacrifices made by veterans. Well, now is the time to stand up and go beyond words and rhetoric. Now is the time to, in fact, address the real problems, the serious problems facing those men and women whose families experienced the ultimate sacrifice and those men and women who came home wounded in body and in spirit. We cannot solve all of the problems facing veterans. We cannot bring back loved ones lost in Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam and the other wars. We can't bring them back to their wives, to their mothers and their dads, to their kids. We can't do that. And we cannot magically replace the arms and the legs lost in war or the eyesight lost in war. But we do have the moral obligation to do everything humanly possible to protect and defend those men and women who protected and defended us. That we can do and that we must do. Mr. President, I am very proud that this legislation that will soon be on the floor has the strong support of virtually every veterans and military organization in this country, and that includes all of the major organizations representing millions and millions of veterans. And I want to thank the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW, the Disabled American Veterans, the DAV, the Vietnam Veterans of America, the Military Officers Association of America, the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, the Gold Star Wives, and dozens of other veterans and military organizations who are supporting this legislation. The Senate Veterans Affairs Committee has received letters of support from virtually all of these organizations, and if members want to check out why these organizations representing millions of veterans are supporting this bill, they will find those letters on our website. Well, let me just say this, that quote from one of the letters, and that was from the Disabled American Veterans. And this is what they write, and I just quote one segment of it. This bill, unprecedented in our modern experience, this is from the DAV, would create, expand, advance, and extend a number of VA benefits, services, and programs that are important to DAV and to our members, end of quote. They see it, as do many of the other veterans organizations, as one of the most comprehensive pieces of veterans legislation brought forth in the modern history of Congress. And I'm proud of that. And I want to thank the veterans organizations not just for their support of this legislation, but for the help that they gave us in drafting this legislation. This legislation did not come from Bernie Sanders. It didn't come from anybody else on the committee. It came from the veterans community itself. It came from representatives of veterans organizations who came before us in hearings, who came before us in private meetings and said, Senator, here are the problems facing our veterans. And if you are serious about going beyond rhetoric and speeches and you really want to help veterans and their families, this is what needs to be done. And we listened. We listened. Couldn't do everything. But we did put in this bill many of the major concerns facing the veterans community. I want to thank the veterans organizations for being our partner in drafting this legislation. I also want to take this opportunity to thank those people who have currently co-sponsored that legislation, and that includes Senator Landrieu, Senator Begich, Senator Schatz, the presiding officer, thank you, Senator, Senator Brown, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Hirono, Senator Boxer, Senator Casey, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Heinrich, Senator Heitkamp, Senator Merkley, Senator Murray, Senator Reid, Senator Shaheen, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Rockefeller, Senator Tester, and Senator Cantwell. I thank all of them for their strong support. Mr. President, let me take a few minutes to just touch on some of the areas that this bill, this comprehensive bill, covers. And as I return to the floor in the coming days, I will go into greater length about each of these provisions, because each of these provisions unto themselves is enormously important in terms of the needs of our veterans. As I mentioned earlier, and consistent with what's on the floor right now, the prior bill, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2000, the bill that our comprehensive veterans bill will restore the cuts made in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013 to military retirees. So in our bill, we address that issue. This comprehensive veterans legislation deals with another issue, not necessarily a sexy issue, but one that in fact impacts a large number of veterans in communities all over America, and that is that it will allow VA to enter into 27 major medical facility leases in 18 states and Puerto Rico. And what that means is that for a variety of reasons too complicated to get into right now, we have CBOCs, community-based outreach clinics, and other veterans facilities that are ready to go, that are needed, that are on the drawing board, that are beyond being on the drawing board, but we haven't been able to pull the plug on it. It is very important to veterans all over this country. It is important to Republicans. It is important to Democrats. It is time to get this done. And by the way, this has been passed in the House of Representatives. We need to do it here, and that is part of this legislation. Mr. President, this legislation includes groundbreaking provisions that would expand access to VA health care. In my view, and in the view of veterans all over this country, the VA provides high-quality, cost-effective care to millions and millions of our veterans. Something like 6.2 million veterans are accessing VA health care today. About 8 million are in the program, signed up for VA care. What this legislation does is expand access to VA health care, allows more veterans to come in, ends a very complicated Priority 8 eligibility, a situation where we have hundreds and hundreds of different eligibility levels all over the country, making it very confusing for Priority 8 veterans to determine whether or not they are eligible. We end that, we simplify it. The result is that more veterans will be able to access VA health care. What we also do is expand complementary and alternative medicine within the VA. The truth is the VA is now doing a good job in providing complementary and alternative medicine. That means meditation, acupuncture, yoga, and other treatments to veterans who are concerned about not being dependent on medication. One of the great problems we have nationally and in the VA is over-medication of people who have problems associated with pain and other ailments. VA has done a good job. We are going to expand that opportunity. My experience, having gone around the country, is that both within the Department of Defense hospitals and the VA, more and more veterans are looking at these alternative-type treatments and want to break their dependence on over-medication. What we also do in this legislation is something terribly important. It is my strong belief that dental care must be considered a part of health care. And the fact is that in this country we have millions of people, above and beyond the veterans community, who cannot find affordable dental care. Right now, within the VA, dental care, with the exception of service-connected problems, homeless veterans, is not open to veterans, and we begin the process through a significant pilot program to bring dental care into the VA, and that to me is extremely important, and I think for the veterans community is important. Mr. President, I think all of us remember not so many months ago the government of the United States was shut down, caused all kinds of problems for all kinds of people. What is not widely known is that veterans, disabled veterans, veterans who are receiving their pensions were 7 to 10 days away from not getting their checks. So you got disabled veterans all over this country who live month to month through those checks, were 7 to 10 days a week, 10 days away from not getting those checks. This legislation provides for advanced appropriations for mandatory VA benefits. And by passing that provision, we will never again put disabled vets or veterans who are dependent on their pensions in the position, if there is ever a shutdown, of not getting their checks when they need it. Mr. President, one of the issues that has been discussed a great deal is the issue of benefits backlog. There is no disagreement in this Senate, whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, that it is not acceptable for veterans who apply for benefits to have to wait years to get those benefits. In my view, what the VA is now doing is undergoing a massive transformation of their benefit system, going from paper, incomprehensible to me that in 2008 their system was paper, going from paper to digital. They are making progress, but I want to see them make more progress. This legislation includes some important provisions to make sure that we end this unacceptable backlog for VA benefits. One of the issues that has also received some attention is the issue of in-state tuition assistance for post-9/11 veterans. And what that has to do with is the fact that a number of years ago we passed very significant legislation which enables some 900,000 veterans today, post-9/11 veterans, to get education throughout this country, higher education, and family members as well. This legislation would give our transitioning service members a fair shot at attaining their educational goals without incurring an additional financial burden, and we deal with the issue of somebody from out of state moving into another state and making sure that that veteran is paying no more than what the in-state tuition is for that state. And this is a very important provision, and by the way, a provision that was passed in the House of Representatives. We have pretty much the same language here in this bill. Mr. President, what we did is promise veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan that they would have 5 years of free VA health care when they came home. We think it is important now, for a variety of reasons. People have not taken advantage of that. We think it's important to extend from 5 to 10 years unfettered access to VA health care for recently separated veterans, and that's what this legislation does. Mr. President, I don't have to mention to anybody that our economy, while slowly improving, still has many, many challenges. Unemployment much, much too high. What this legislation would do is reauthorize provisions from the Vow to Hire Heroes Act of 2011, including a 2-year extension for the Veterans Retraining Assistance Program, the VRAP program. In other words, what we are saying to our veterans is when you come home, we want a job to be there for you. We want you to get integrated back into civilian life. So we have some very important provisions in here for employment opportunities for our veterans. As I mentioned earlier, sexual assault is a scandal. The numbers are appallingly high. And what this legislation does is enable those women and men who were sexually assaulted to come into the VA to get the quality of care that their situations require and deserve. And this provision was inspired by Ruth Moore, who struggled for 23 years to receive VA disability compensation. So we have language in there making sure that those who suffered sexual assault will get the care within the VA that they absolutely are entitled to. I mentioned earlier also, Mr. President, that several thousand men and women who served in Iraq and Afghanistan were wounded in ways that make it impossible for them to have babies. And these are people who really want families. And some of them are now spending a very significant amount of money in the private sector through a number of approaches in order to be able to have babies. And we have language provision in this bill which would help female and male veterans who have suffered significant spinal cord, reproductive and urinary tract injuries to start a family. I think that that is an absolutely right thing to do. Mr. President, several years ago, this Congress did the right thing by establishing a Caregivers Act, which said to those people who are caring for disabled vets that we understand how difficult that work is, that you are taking care of people who need constant attention, loved ones who need constant attention, and we are going to help you doing what you have been doing. The good news is that we passed that legislation. The bad news is that it only applied to post-9/11 veterans. And I think there was a general understanding and assumption that we were going to expand that program to all veterans, Vietnam, World War II, Korea, so that those people, mostly women who are staying home taking care of veterans, get the support that they need. So the extension of the Caregivers Act is also included in this legislation. Those are some of the provisions. This is a 400-page bill, and I just touched on some of them. But let me end in the way that I began. There is no way that we can ever fully repay the debt we owe to the men and women who put their lives on the line defending this country. That's just the simple nature of things. We're not going to bring back the husbands who were lost in war, the wives who came back without any legs. We're not going to bring fathers back to children who lost their dad or their mom. We're not going to restore eyesight to people who are blind. We can't do that. But if this country means anything, it means that we have got to keep the promises that we made to veterans and to their families. That while we can't do everything, we have got to do as much as we can to make the lives of our veterans and their families, their loved ones, as happy and productive as we possibly can. So this legislation is legislation that listened to our veterans, heard their concerns, worked with them, and developed this comprehensive bill. And let me conclude once again by thanking all of the veterans organizations. And we have virtually every veterans organization in America, not all, but almost all, supporting this legislation. We thank them for the work that they do every day on behalf of our veterans, and I thank them very much for all of the help they have provided me and the committee in writing this legislation. Mr. President, speeches on Veterans Day and Memorial Day are great. That's good. It's an important thing that we all do. But now is the time to go beyond speeches. Now is the time to address the problems facing the veterans community. This legislation does this in a very comprehensive way, and I ask for the support of all my colleagues in the Senate. Thank you. I yield the floor.
President, before my colleague leaves the floor, Mr. President,
Michigan.
thank you very much. Before the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee leaves the floor, I just want to say thank you to him for his passion and advocacy. The legislation he spoke of this morning is incredibly important. If I'm not yet on that bill, Senator Sanders, I need to be and will be. Please sign me up. It's absolutely true that we need to do more than just make speeches. We need to put our commitment, our resources, keep our promises to our veterans. That's what this bill does, and we thank you very, very much. We also, Mr. President, have a bill in front of us that is about our veterans. And this bill, whoops, maybe someone can come down and help me out here on this. This bill is about our veterans, and the question is on a yes or no on this final bill. Do we support our veterans? You vote yes. If we do not support our veterans, we want to play political games with it, find some other excuse not to support veterans, then you vote no. It's very simple. Keep our promise, vote yes. Don't care about keeping our promise, vote no. We had a vote last night here in the Senate to end a filibuster that I think was embarrassing that we had to have the vote. And I want to thank our friend and colleague, the senior senator from Arkansas, Senator Pryor, for putting this forward along with a number of colleagues. But we should not even have had to have a vote to end a filibuster and move forward on this bill. This is something that everyone should want to do as quickly as possible. It should not be controversial. But unfortunately, instead of moving it forward and getting this done, we are seeing Republican colleagues who are arguing about amendments, amazingly, that would increase taxes on families in order to, quote, pay for helping our veterans. Now, I think every veteran in America should find this absolutely outrageous. I know that I do. These men and women have sacrificed for our nation. Some did not come home. Some came home without an arm or a leg or a closed head injury. They have paid in full for this bill, Mr. President. Paid in full. That's what we stamp on this piece of legislation. I'm proud to represent nearly 700,000 veterans that are living in Michigan, veterans and their families. That's my pay for this bill. They have paid in full to make sure that they get their veterans benefits, their pensions, the health care that we promised them. And I'd like to read just a very few of the names of people in Michigan, Mr. President, that either pay for or I offer today on the floor of the Senate. Richard Below from St. Joseph, Michigan, retired from the Coast Guard after 21 years of service. 21 years of service. He has paid in full for this bill. Bill Garlinghouse of Holland spent 22 years in the Navy. I'm partial to the Navy. My dad was in the Navy. And then 5 years working for the Navy as a civilian. 22 years in the Navy, 5 years working for the Navy as a civilian. He has paid in full for this bill. Richard Eversole of Sumner spent 22 years in the Air Force, retired as a master sergeant. Richard has paid in full for this bill. Frank Bell from Kalamazoo retired 10 years ago as a senior master sergeant in the United States Air Force. He's 51 years old, so he will see his pension cut by 1% every year for the next 11 years. This needs to be fixed now. No games, no debating about amendments. Yes or no on making sure Frank Bell gets his full pension because he has paid in full for this bill. David Lord of Sheboygan retired from the Navy after 20 years of service. Again, he has paid in full. John Frollo of St. Charles spent 20 years in the Navy before retiring in 2006. Joseph Borgren of Gwinn, Michigan, spent 32 years in the Navy, served in Iraq and Afghanistan. He flew 177 combat missions, defending our country, putting himself in harm's way on behalf of all of us. I believe that Joseph Bogren has paid in full for his pension and the other benefits that we have promised he and his family. Debbie Rasmussen from Sheridan, Michigan, wrote in on behalf of her military family. Debbie and her husband are both Navy veterans, and their son Matt is an active duty sailor with over 15 years of service, including service in Afghanistan. And they believe, and I believe, the Rasmussens have paid in full for this benefit. Karen Rudicelli is the wife of an active duty Army major currently stationed at the Pentagon. Kurt and Karen have been a military family for 12 years. The Rudicellis have paid in full. I could go on and on with so many similar letters. Every service is represented in these letters because veterans from every part of our armed services would be hurt by what has been put in place. We know that this needs to be addressed and needs to be fixed. We've all said that this needs to be fixed. We need to honor the commitment we have made to the men and women who have served us and continue to serve us. This bill will restore the cost of living adjustments for all military retirees. We need to act now so that our veterans have the certainty and the peace of mind they need to move forward with their lives. We should not be involved in wrangling and folks trying to find political advantage and take political hostages, score points in some way. We need to just get this done. No amendments, no jockeying here, just vote for this bill and get this done. This bill is about keeping our promise to the men and women who have served us and continue to serve us. A yes vote says we've got your back. A yes vote says we honor and support you. A no vote or other votes that confuse the situation and play political games are really votes that turn your back on our veterans. Very simple. Vote yes to get this done. No distractions. No extraneous issues. No matter how people feel about other things, bringing them into this is not right, it's not fair. This is about yes for veterans or no for veterans. And I hope, Mr. President, that we will all stand together and understand the pay for are the people who have served in our states and continue to serve us today. They have paid in full. We need to vote yes and get this done. Madam President, I have 5 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders, and I would ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Madam President, I come to the floor today to discuss the stagnant Obama economy and how Obamacare is making things worse. This Monday marks the 5th anniversary